The goal of the minority attack is to create at least one weakness in the opponent's pawn structure and then apply pressure with as many pieces as possible. After playing and analyzing many games with both colors, in such positions, I have come to the conclusion that the advantage of the minority attack mainly consists in the attacker having a good center and no weaknesses in their own position. Moreover, it's always easier to play with a long-term plan without risk than to counter-attack against that plan, since this requires knowing the precise move order. To put it more simply, the minority attack is very much a practical advantage, and in my opinion, this advantage is often overestimated. In the various examples, we will learn many different methods to counter the minority attack. The pawn push a7, a5, the flexible approach with b7, b6, maximum flexibility with a7, a6, the blockade b7, b5, the active responses with a6 takes b5 and then the push c6, c5, or c takes b5 and then the push a6, a5. Once the minority attack is neutralized, it's important to try to play actively on the other wing. Fighting the minority attack often requires dynamic play, mainly through changes in the pawn structure and appropriate exchanges, and the goal of this chapter is to master this aspect of the game as well. To be successful, one must understand the details that justify the use of each method and develop one's intuition in this direction. Good luck. This position is a result white can often achieve when black plays passively. The pawn on c6 is weak, and white is quite successful in practice. Nevertheless, the evaluation of this pawn structure is not so easy. In my opinion, white needs a second weakness in black's game to win the game. For example, a weak a-pawn or, as is often the case, the bad light-squared bishop. The important thing here is not to overestimate white's advantage. When I prepared this course, I selected nice games of top players with 1-0 as a result, and then analyzed them with the engine. Often I was quite surprised. White has a more comfortable and risk-free position, but black should almost always be able to defend successfully, if they play correctly. The classic way for black is freeing the position with c6, c5. After trading on c5, the pawn on d5 is isolated, but trading pawns almost always is the right approach for black. If possible, black can continue with d5, d4. If not, a passive defense of d5 is often enough to hold. And if the pawn on d5 is sadly lost anyway, many endgames with 4 pawns for white against 3 pawns for black are still theoretically draws. And speaking of passive defense, if you get this pawn structure and there are no minor pieces left on the board, let's say there is the queen and 1 or 2 rooks left for each player, then a passive defense of the weakness on c6 will be enough to hold the draw. Now we will have a look at the game Serawan against Tal played 40 years ago. I think this game is quite interesting to see that if black trades some pieces, he will be able to defend relatively easily his weakness on c6, and even with a bad bishop. So the opening was nothing special. Nimzowitsch. I think Tal plays in this game a very solid position, and maybe it doesn't suit his style, and that's the reason why he had some difficulties. Tal was a very creative player, and to play like that with black is probably not very optimal for him. So here white prevents c5, and it's important already to understand that c5 is the main idea for black. If black is able to free his position with this pawn break, then he gets rid of the weakness on c6, and the new weakness on d5 after the trade on c5 is not so difficult to protect. So typically it's possible to protect d5 with the 4 remaining pieces, and the position will be more or less equal. So the goal for white is to prevent c5 and to improve his pieces, of course. An achievement would be also to trade the light square bishop against the strong black knight. So for example, in the game, queen a5, a very interesting move to try, for example, to play queen a7, bishop a6 to trap the rook on c8, and also simply to have more space for the pieces. Here, black played knight, didn't play knight e6, played king f8. After knight e6, I think a good move is bishop g4. And here we see the idea, we want to take on e6, and then to have a situation, good knight against a weak bishop. So here it's too early for knight e6, but in general, knight e6 followed by c5 is the plan for black. So king f8, a strange move, but I think Tal anticipated the move queen a7 and now offers the trade. Also very important to understand, if black is going to trade more pieces, it will make the weakness on c6 clearly less weak. And a queen trade is very important, because after that black will simply bring his king to d6 and he will play c5 very easily. So in general, to trade the EV pieces is good for black. So queen b6, of course not queen e7. So here white wants to enter with queen h7, so king g8. And we have almost the same position than several moves ago. So white is not really able to improve. There are always some little tricks, like for example, a move like knight b7 is not good because of bishop a6. And here white achieves the good trade, bishop against knight. So this check is purely practical. I mean, it's nothing special. I think king f8 and king h8 are both okay. Tal decided to play king h8. Bishop f5. A very surprising move, because normally this trade is bad for white. Here, CR1 has a very concrete idea, very interesting, in fact. After the take on f5, so knight e6 makes absolutely no sense because of bishop e6. That's something really to remember. White wants absolutely to have this situation, good knight against bad bishop. But here, of course, black trades the bishop. And here, knight h4. So what is the idea? After knight e6, in order to push c5, queen f5, Tal finds c5, and here suddenly, probably with no time on the clock, he played queen e7, a big mistake. I think he rejected rook c5 because he saw in this variation the move knight f5. And again, the problem is purely practical. In fact, this position is okay for black, but in practice, sometimes you see some ghost and you cannot find the solution. So the main idea is, of course, if king g8, knight e7 with a fork, and d5 is gone. King h7, king g6 is too slow, and at the end the same fork with knight e7 will come. And if black cannot improve his king, white will play very fast king f1, king e2, king d3. So the next moves are quite clear. Then king d4 and d5 is very weak. But in fact, here it's possible to play tactically g6. And if knight h6, the knight is suddenly trapped. So g6 is solving all the problems, in fact. And after knight e7, now the king can come back. King g7, king f8. And this position is about equal because d5 is simply not lost. So it's important to know that in a knight endgame, 4 pawns against 3 pawns on the same wing, the 4 pawns are winning. So that's why it's very important for black not to lose the pawn on d5. So rook c5 was completely okay, and Tal suddenly played queen e7, losing the control. And here he played queen d7, very strange. In fact, after rook c5, black is losing a pawn, but probably this position is possible to defend. Again, very important is here not to trade queens with black, but with the queens on the board, it's always possible to find counterplay when white is going forward with this pawn majority. And the goal, of course, is to find a perpetual check at some point. In practice, it will be very difficult, but I think theoretically it's possible to hold. So queen d7, c6 is the winning move, and this endgame is hopeless for black. So white objectively won because of the mistakes from Tal. I think we saw in this game that if black is careful and just focuses on freeing his position with c5, I think it's not far to be equal. Of course, with more pieces on the board, it will be more difficult to achieve. So it's important to remember that black wants to free his position with c5. He wants also to trade pieces in general, because with less pieces on the board, at some point he reaches an endgame where he can activate his king, especially when the EV pieces are gone. How can white improve the position? So here the move is bishop g4, with the intention clearly to trade the bishop against the strong black knight. And after this trade, black won't be able to push c5 anymore, and we will simply, with white, improve the knight and increase the advantage. So probably black will have to go back and avoid the trade. And here we can apply a bit of pressure. For example, after knight d7, queen a6. So black cannot push c5, and white keeps a small advantage. It's not much, of course, because to trade the light squared bishops doesn't bring much, but it's still a bit unpleasant for black. And after queen d7, this endgame is also a bit unpleasant. For example, if black plays c5 too fast, then comes knight f4, and it's not possible to protect d5 and c5 at the same time. After king f8, we can maybe take some space on the king side and hope to apply even more pressure in the endgame. I think black should hold that, but it's really unpleasant to defend. Should white exchange queens? So the answer is a clear no. If you trade queens in this position, then black will take back with the king and bring the king to d6 and then push c5, and then it will be equal. So it's very important to keep as many pieces as possible, with the exception of the light square bishop who could be traded against the knight. But normally with white you try to keep your EV pieces to prevent c5 and apply more pressure, and also prevent that black activates his king. So queen b6, queen c7, again, we don't want to trade, so queen b1, and it's a small advantage for white. Black has just played knight b7. Why is this move a mistake? So here with white, we are a bit lucky. We have bishop a6, and we can reach this very good trade, good bishop against very good knight. So it's favorable for white, and then it will be a situation with good knight against bad bishop, and I think it will simply increase the advantage. How can black improve their position? So typically the way to equalize here is to push c5, and here it works tactically. So there is this small practical problem to solve, but here of course we cannot play king g8 because knight e7 check wins d5, and probably the game later, because an endgame knight and 4 pawns against knight and 3 pawns on the same wing is a theoretical win. But here there is a tactical solution, g6, and if white takes h6, then suddenly the knight is trapped after f5. And if white goes away, as we play, for example, knight e7, very logical, then we can improve our king. And we will hold d5 in this position, and the game should be a draw. So now we will look at a model game played by you and Hari Krishna. I think this game is very important to understand how to defend when white is applying pressure against c6. And the main topic in this game is the queenside counterplay for black. So let's look at the game. So black plays knight f8, knight e6. So it's a very interesting plan. I think it's an easy one to play with black. The goal is to play knight g7, bishop f5 to be sure to trade the light square bishop. So knight g7 is possible. In the game, Hari Krishna played short castle first. Knight g7 doesn't change much, except that now white has a tactical idea, b4, and it's not possible to take this pawn because of knight d5. So it's a very nice trap, very useful to know. The idea is after cd5, queen f4, and this position is just horrible for black. White has a bishop pair, a better king, a better pawn structure. And if instead queen d5, bishop f6, e4, and the center is very strong, and a fianchetto knight on g7 is most of the time quite weak, and here it's not an exception. So this position is just much better for white. But in fact, b4 is interesting, but not as strong as it seems, because if black reacts calmly with a6, then we transpose to the game. So this position is what we will see in the game. So short castle first, and now bishop f5. So of course it's good to trade these bishops, but it's also very slow, and that's why white has no problems to create a weakness on c6. But we will see that it's not so easy to apply pressure on c6. Contrary to the game Serra won against Tal. In fact, here black has no bad piece. There is no bad bishop, so it favors for sure the defender. Something here interesting. The good move is knight f5. I had this position on the board long time ago against a German grandmaster, Klaus Bischoff. and he played rook a3. I think it's a very instructive mistake, because rook a3 is strategically sound. It's a normal move, but in this particular position it doesn't work. And the reason is black is not able to keep the file because of, after rook a1, queen a8 or queen a5, that's the same, is losing after take, knight e5, and there is no good way to protect c6. The logical move rook c8 loses tactically after take f6 and take d5, and suddenly black is lost. The other moves are not better. For example, queen d6, we have queen a6, and surprisingly rook c8 is not possible, so c6 is lost. Queen a8 preventing queen a6 doesn't work because of take and fork with knight d7. So it means in the game, after rook a3 and rook a1, black has to give back the file and take on a1. So here I made a very instructive mistake. I played rook c1. I found it very logical to apply pressure against c6, but the problem of this move is I'm giving back the a file. So it's much better, if I want to attack c6, I should play a move like rook a6. It's better than rook c1 because, for example, here, it's difficult for black to fight back. We attack c6 on the c file and also on the 6th rank. And I think after we will play knight f4, knight c5 probably, and improve the pieces. Black has no counterplay on the queen side. Rook e6 is maybe not the best move, in fact. I think knight f4 is a bit more precise. First, improving the knight, and then playing in the same way on the a file. For example, if queen a8, queen c3 protects rook a1 and prepares knight c5. If queen c7, then knight c5, queen a3, and it's very important to have again the a file under control. So in the game, after rook c1, my opponent played a very strong maneuver, something that we will see in our model game You against Hare Krishna. He played queen a8. So he understands the value of the a file. And now, again, a very strong move, rook b8. So now black owns the two open files. And there is a typical way to equalize in this sort of position. It's to play rook b4, followed by rook c4. And this position is about equal, exactly like in the model game. Because if white has no rooks anymore, it's impossible to win the pawn on c6. So very important, this fight for the a file is very often underestimated. And it's a very important point simply in this type of position. So knight f5 immediately is more precise. Now rook c1. And here we will look at queen d6. Another interesting idea is rook a3. Now the difference, of course, is queen a8 is possible after rook a1, so black doesn't lose the a file. So now we follow a game Van Velde-Navarra, and white played queen c2. And here, exactly like in the previous example, queen a8. So here, white has a tactical idea, knight takes d5 and rook takes f6. but Navarra found bishop d8, and again the rook trade is favorable for black. And this position is slightly better for white, but not more. The reason is white has still one rook, so he has also some hope to apply pressure against c6, but it's not much in fact. So it's also a possible way to play with black. You can here play rook a3 like Navarra and queen a8. It will trade one rook. But Harikrishna decided to play queen d6. And here rook fb8. Also very logical. And in this position, he applies exactly the same ideas than in the previous game. Rook b4, rook c4. And now there are no rooks anymore on the board, and it means the position is equal. So the next moves are not very important. I think white is okay to make a draw, and black accepts. So here there are no minor pieces anymore, and it's impossible for white to attack c6 two times. So the position is clearly equal. How can black solve the problem with the bishop on c8? So here the way to trade this bad bishop is to play knight g7 and bishop f5. And here, very important, we force the trade on f6, and then we will try to trade the EV pieces on the queen side. So this position is slightly better for white, but if black knows how to continue, I think it's not so difficult to hold that. What is the right method to equalize completely? So here our goal is to trade the last rook, and we can do that playing rook b4 first, and then rook c4. So it's a very important maneuver to remember. After the trade of the rooks, in fact, the position is already equal because white is not able to attack c6 several times. How can white improve their pieces? So here we can improve our knight before attacking c6. Here the knight on c3 is, we could say, a bit dominated by c6 d5, and our goal is to reach the square c5 first, and then play against c6, probably with rook a6, and for sure using the a file. So a good move here is knight a4. For example, if black plays queen a8, we have queen c3 protecting a1, and then knight c5 attacking the queen. If queen c7, queen a3, and we own the a file, and I think black has absolutely no counterplay. It's impossible to play rook b8 because of knight a6 with a fork. So both files on the queen side are more or less controlled by white, and it makes the position much easier to play, of course. What is the plan for black in order to equalize properly? So here, a very important move, queen a8. It will allow to take the control of both files on the queen side, and then we will play rook b8, rook b4, and rook c4, and we manage to trade the last rook and to equalize the game. So this position is completely equal. White cannot apply enough pressure against c6, and we will try to continue to trade pieces. and it should be an easy draw. We already know that for white to have winning chances, black needs to have two weak points. In these structures with pawns on c6 and d5, the light-squared bishop is often a problem for black. However, we have also seen in the game Serra 1 Tal that even in this case, white still needs a little help from the opponent to win. Now, we will learn that the winning chances for white are much higher when black has a second weak pawn on the a file. This situation occurs when black forgets to exchange his a pawn against the minority attack. Typically, black should play a6 takes b5 or a5 takes b4 to avoid this problem. So black has just played rook a d8, which doesn't help at all against the minority attack. And we will see that here white can create a second weakness. We will follow a game Milos against Dublan. I think instead of rook d8, it's important for black to play a6. And this position is anyway very passive for black. White will be able to play a4, b5 at some point. But if black plays first a6, he will be able to trade his a pawn after b5. So in the best case, white will create one weakness on c6, but nothing more. So the problem of allowing a4, b5 in this position is that a7 will remain on the board and will become a second weakness. So here white played a very instructive move, knight e2. So knight e2 controls the square c4, and it's important, for example, if we play a4, black could find some counterplay with knight c4. So it's a typical idea to play knight c4 in this sort of position. And if we play b5 immediately, black has c5. So also a typical pawn break in case of b5. So now we understand why knight e2 is so precise. Both squares c5 and c4 are under control. So here with black, I will play immediately a6. I think it is the last moment to do it. And of course, white has some pressure. For example, knight b3 is a good move. If knight c4, tactically knight c5 is working because knight a3, queen a4, take on b7, and we will take on d8, take back on b1, and at the end white has an extra pawn. If rook b8, simply take e6 and take c4, and white wins also a pawn. So tactically knight c5 is working, and I think, yeah, that's the problem here in this position. White can improve first his knight and then play for a4, b5. So for example, bishop c8, knight a5, a very good move. It's very tempting to play knight c5 automatic here, but a5 is a better square. Because now when we play a4, b5, we can also play against c6 directly and play on the c file. And if black takes on b5, we have also a target on b7. So knight a5 here is quite strong. In the game, black played bishop c8, and b5 comes immediately. So of course white could also play a4, but in this case black will react with a6, and after b5, black will trade his a pawn. So to play b5 immediately is a way to be sure that a7 remains on the board. And now rook a5. As a rule, when you play for the initiative, it's very important to have some threats, because here black has to defend and cannot fight back. So for example, a move like a6, we just play rook b1, and it's clear that b7 becomes a second threat, and also b6 is not stable anymore. So it will be much too passive for black. Knight a8, bishop c8, all these pieces are doing nothing. So in the game, knight c8 was played. And here a good defensive move, bishop c6. So now the bishop is helping to build a safe pawn structure, b7, c6, d5. And white needs to find an idea to break this mini fortress, let's say. And the answer is very interesting, bishop b5. So it shows us how relative the term good or bad bishop is. Of course, bishop d3 is better than bishop c6, but bishop c6 was stopping the initiative on the queen side. And it makes a lot of sense here to trade the bishops because the remaining pieces are very active for white, and black with knight c8 and knight f8 is not able to fight back. So it's more important to open the c-file than to keep the good bishop. So take c6 and knight d3. And here we see that black has two weaknesses, a7 and c6. So with just one weakness on c6, it will be passive to defend. But with two weaknesses, it's much more difficult. For example, here we see that knight c8 has to stay on his passive square. If not, a7 will be lost. And white has a simple job here. He simply improves his pieces and targets at the same time c6 and a7. So the next move is knight b4, and white has two attackers against c6, two attackers against a7, and it's very difficult to prevent a material loss here with black. So queen d6 is not good because of rook c6, and tactically black collapses. For example, queen c6, queen e7, and knight f1 is winning. After the trade, we see that black remains with a pawn down and again two weaknesses. So a7 and d5 are still weak, and this endgame is for sure much better for white. What is the best square for the rook? So here we go to f5 because after this move, a7 is under attack, and if black protects with knight c8, then he will be very passive. And if he plays a6, here we can play rook b1, and we have a lot of pressure on the b file because knight b6 is not stable anymore, and b7 is the next target. So if he plays rook c8, we just move the queen, and the problem remains on a7. So here d5 is attacked, and knight c8 is too passive. Black has big problems. How can white bring down black's shaky fortress on the queen side? So bishop c6 is the main, let's say the main defender in this position, and we need to play bishop b5. Even if we trade the good bishop against the bad one, it's very important to be able to apply pressure on the queen side, and bishop b5 is the move. And now we see that we created a second weakness on a7 and c6. Black has two weaknesses, and it will be very easy to apply pressure with white. So this position is much better for white, and the rook on a5 is very important. So now let's have a look at a second example to see how to create a second weakness and to exploit it. So the opening was quite usual. And now we reach an interesting moment. In the game, black decided to play short castle and later rook e8, knight f8 with the plan g6, knight e6, knight g7 and bishop f5. So I think this plan is very interesting. And we saw it already in the game You Hare Krishna. And I want to say that a better move order for black is to play knight f8 immediately. So I think it's very important, in fact. Playing knight f8 immediately, you will be able to play knight e6 without rook e8. So you almost save one move. And something even more important, you reduce white options. Because if you play knight e6 before playing g6, white cannot play bishop h6 anymore. So I think it makes a lot of sense, and I don't want to spoil it now, but we will look at this plan later in the next chapter, speaking about other methods for white. So in the game, black played short castle. Now rook b1, knight e6, and bishop h4. So bishop h6 is here another option. Knight g7, b4, and now a very important mistake, bishop f5. So bishop f5 is not precise. Here it's very important to play a6 first, and then bishop f5. The big difference is when white plays b5, black is able to trade his a pawn with a b5. So at the end, white will just create probably a weakness on c6, but not on a7. So when we play here bishop f5, the problem is b5 immediately, followed by bc6. If black plays c5, it's a tactical mistake. So black is not able to solve this problem with this typical pawn break, because here white wins some material. And black cannot take back the pawn on c5. c6 is coming, and I think this position should be winning for white. So in the game, black took on d3, following the usual plan. And now we have the same pawn structure than in the game You Hare Krishna. The only difference is white has a pawn on a2 and black a pawn on a7. And here clearly we can say that a7 is a second weakness, even if we don't see it immediately because the queen on a5 is seemingly active. At some point we are able to attack a7 playing rook b7. If we can chase the queen, we could also try to play queen a6 at some point. Something very important, if you remember the game You Hare Krishna, you know that the a file is quite useful to create some counterplay. And with a pawn on a7, rook a8 is not able to find this counterplay, and it plays a big role, in fact, in the evaluation. So queen c2 is a very normal move. Knight c5 is a creative solution. I think to take on a2 is very dangerous, because now the queen has not so many squares, and we will try to win it simply playing rook c1, rook b8, rook a4. So the queen is almost trapped here, and white has a lot of play. Maybe more logical is here knight d6, but in this case queen a6 is very interesting. Here we want to win back the a file, even if the file is not open. If we can chase the queen, controlling the square a6 is very powerful. because we attack a7 and c6 already. And if black trades the queens, we see that this knight on a6 is very strong. We will follow with rook c1. And if black covers c6 with knight c4, we can enter with rook b7. So this position is clearly much better for white. Of course, here the threat is also to play knight c7 with a fork. So it's very difficult to defend this position with black. And here we see really the difference with the pawns on a2 and a7. Without these pawns, the knight will have to leave, and knight a6 wouldn't be possible simply. And I think black would be able to hold that easily with knight c4, rook c8, bishop e7. It would be impossible to have a knight on c5, also not a knight on b4, and the knight on c4 would cover c6 easily. So we see what happens with the pawns on a2 and a7. It clearly favors white. So in the game, white played simply queen c2, also a good move. And here the same idea, white tries to trade queens with queen c5. So queen f4 is not very good, but queen c5 is not much better because in fact again when black plays knight c4, we can enter with rook b7, and here clearly a7 is a new target. So this position should win step by step. So in the game, queen takes a4, queen d6, and bishop e7, probably a mistake. Rook e6 is not so strong, even if it's better than rook e7. We can play queen d7, queen b7, and we continue to apply pressure. So this position is better for white. After bishop e7, now we have another weakness. We can try to play against f7. So for example, queen a2, knight e5. And here we see that black has now three weaknesses: a7, d5, and f7. So this position is clearly won. And we will soon win d5, and with two extra pawns, plus again some initiative, it should be quite easy to win. Black wants to exchange the light squared bishops. Is it good to play bishop f5 now? So clearly the answer is no. If we play bishop f5, white is able to create a second weakness with b5. So the second weakness will be the pawn on a7 after the trade on c6. So for example, take, 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 and now clearly black will have preferred to reach this pawn structure without the pawns on a2 and a7 on the board. So a7 is a new target for white, and of course it's easier to fight against two targets. So this position is unnecessary for black. And in the starting position, it's much better to start with a6. And when white plays f4 with the idea b5, now it's possible to trade the bishops. And in case of b5, black will play a takes b5 and will stay with just one target on c6. And we saw already in this course that with one target on c6, we can hold with black. So it makes a huge difference. Very important is to play this move a6 first and then trade the bishops. I often find it difficult to say if black should play a5 or not. There are two main situations in which a5 is interesting: when black wants to prophylactically prevent the minority attack or counter it. In short, one plays a5 before white plays b4 or after. In practice, the decision is not easy because black could also often wait with a6. Then you have to understand well enough the position to decide between a5 and a6. Quite often, both options are totally playable, and in this case, I will say that the solution is simply a matter of taste. So now let's look at a very interesting game, Leko against Kramnik, played in 2020. Kramnik is an absolute master of the Carlsbad structure, and in his game he demonstrates how to stop the minority attack with the move a5. So the opening was a Queen's Gambit, and here already Kramnik plays knight bd7. I like a lot this move. The idea is to have more flexibility against bishop f4. In case of bishop f4, instead of just playing bishop e7, it's possible to take on c4 or to play bishop f4, like in a Ragozin variation. So it gives more options simply, and I think it's a good way to face bishop f4 in general. So Leko took on d5, and now we reach the Carlsbad structure. So these moves are quite normal for this position. Knight e4, the typical way to trade some pieces. And soon we reach a critical position. So here, how to stop b4, b5. There are several ways. I like a lot what Kramnik played. He decided to stop b4 immediately with a5. Knight b6 is also possible, but here we have to understand some important details. In this position, I think the best move is bishop e6. And bishop e6 is probably enough to hold. If you follow with a6, the big problem is that white takes a lot of space, but is also not committed to play b5 fast. And the problem here is he can play a5. So of course, if he plays b5, we have the typical idea, cb5, a5, and now it justifies totally the move knight b6, because the knight on b6 protects d5, will support a5, a4, and is also ready to jump to the square c4. So there is no better square for a knight in this position than b6. But in order to achieve that, we need a bit of help. And if white is careful, he will play here a5. And after, for example, knight d7, knight f4, suddenly the knight on d7 is not very good, and white is going to play f3, e4. And if white plays in the center with f3, e4, we would like to have some counterplay against d4, but a knight on d7 cannot fight against d4. So the knight should go to e6, but e6 is not available. There is already the bad bishop on it, and white has simply an advantage. If we go for the, if we go to the square d6, in fact, here it's also not very useful, because f3, e4 is coming, and soon e4, e5, and knight d6 will simply be a target. So it's very important to understand that in this structure, and also in many other openings, there is a fight between knights and pawns. So the pawns should keep some flexibility to adapt to the knights, and the knight shouldn't show immediately where he wants to go, and should wait for some good squares. So when we go very fast to b6 in this position, there is a risk that white can adapt his pawn play to our knight. I think the real mistake is not knight b6, but a6. If we play bishop e6, it's a bit different, because after b5, in fact, we can play rook c8 and take with the rook on c6. it makes a big difference, because if we take with the pawn, now we have two weaknesses, like in the previous examples. C6 and A7 are weak, and white has clearly an advantage. So the idea is to allow B5 because we can take back with the rook on C6, and I think this position is totally okay. There is a correspondence game also played in 2015, and black was able to hold, so it's a good sign for us. Here we trade the rooks, and in fact, in an endgame without any EVPs, it's very easy to protect d5, bringing the king to d6. We have also a pawn majority on the queen side, and it can help, of course, in the endgame. So black tries to trade the queens and brings the king to the center. Nothing happens. I think black has a good position. So it's possible to allow b4, b5. And knight b6 is definitely an alternative to the game. But I still prefer the move of Kramnik. I think a5, preventing that white wins too easily some space, is a very good move. But it's very important to understand that this setup with knight b6 and a6 is very good against the minority attack, but can be bad if white is able to change his mind and suddenly play in the center. Because in this case, knight b6 and a6 are doing absolutely nothing against f3, e4. So it's really an important point. So I think the move of Kramnik is much easier to play. So white played knight a4 because he understands that in case of a3, Kramnik wants to play knight b6. And here there is a very important idea against the minority attack. I mean, there are many ways of facing the minority attack, but this one is also very typical. The idea is to jump into the attack with knight c4. So now a3 is a target, and if white is not careful, black will follow with b5, supporting the knight on c4. And in this case, we could say that black takes the initiative on the queen side. So after knight c4, white has to take. And now we still have the idea of supporting the pawn on c4 with b5, so white has to play b5. We take a3. And here queen d3, it's not the only move, but queen d3 is quite okay. And in this endgame, I think black has nothing to fear because bishop a6, bishop b5 is coming quite soon. And it will cover the pawn on c6. It will maybe help a5 to advance. And this endgame is about equal. So Leko decided to play knight a4 to prevent knight b6. And now I like a lot the decision of Kramnik, king g8. So it took me some time to understand why king g8. Because if you follow the next moves, you see that Kramnik wants to play on the king side with g6 and king g7 and later h5. And why not to do it immediately? Why is it so important to lose some time with king g8? So the reason is, again, that if we show too fast our intention with g6, white has the time to change his mind and not to play for the minority attack, but for a central pawn break. And suddenly, a move like g6 will be weakening. So now rook e1, and we can forget about the attack on the king side because f3, e4 is coming. And I think now the king on g7 is a bit weak. So maybe e4 is not immediately possible because after the trade on e4, d4 will be hanging. But the next move for white is for sure queen f2, defending d4, and then e4. So it shows that black has to be careful. An attack on the king side will work only if white is not able to open the center. So that's why Kramnik takes his time and plays simply king g8. And now queen d6. And only now, because white is committed to his play on the queen side, only now Kramnik plays g6. Now it will take a lot of time to reorganize the previous setup with rook f1, rook b, e1, knight c3, f3, and then e4. So now it's possible for black to play on the king side. So here Leko plays queen c3. So the minority attack is well prepared, but strangely very slow. Why not b4? Because after b4, black has this typical reaction b5. And again, if black is able to bring a knight to c4, he will cover c6 very easily. And I think when the knight reaches c4, we can say that b4 is even weaker than c6. So white has to be very careful. In case of knight c5 here, we can even trade several pieces on c5 with knight takes c5, queen takes c5, queen takes c5, and then we will protect c6 with bishop d7. So for example, this variation. So if white takes back with a pawn, c6 is anyway covered. And if rook c5, simply bishop d7, and black owns the only open file in this position, and I think it's even simpler to play with black. So in the game queen c3, the idea is to play rook a1 followed by b4. But it takes a lot of time, and Kramnik is able to create his counterplay. So queen f6, b4, take, queen g5. And the idea is to play next move knight f6, threatening bishop takes h3. In case white moves his king, then we can play bishop f5 to trade the bishops, and also knight e4 is in the air. So suddenly Kramnik has a lot of play, and I find his strategy really instructive, because if you look at this position, you see that white was able to follow his usual plan, the minority attack, and Kramnik has still pieces almost not developed, bishop c8, knight d7, but his strategy worked very well, and even if he didn't develop all of his pieces, in fact he is able to create counterplay, and the minority attack is nothing when black is able to target the king. So a king side attack has much more value than a minority attack on the queen side. And I think Kramnik won a lot of time playing this move a5, reducing the options on the queen side for white. So it's really an important game, and we have a lot to learn from Kramnik in general, but in the Carlsbad structure especially. What is the best way for black to stop the minority attack? So here Kramnik played a5. I think it's a very good move. An alternative is knight b6, also possible. But after b4, we have to be precise and find bishop e6. Bishop e6, rook c1. And when white plays b5, we follow with rook c8. And the idea is to take back with the rook and not with the pawn, because in this case we will create some weaknesses. And taking back with the rook, now we are going to play rook a c8 and trade the EV pieces on the c5, and this position is okay. very important is to understand that if we play a6, welcoming the minority attack, because if white plays b5, we have cb5 followed by a5. The problem is white has another idea. He can change his mind and play a5, followed by f3, e4 quite soon. And here our minor pieces are not so good to face this central pawn break. So that's why I prefer the move of Kramnik, a5 simply. And with a5, black is simply gaining some space on the queen side, and it's very difficult to push a3 b4 properly for white. White is playing the minority attack. How should black react? So here a very typical way to face the minority attack is to jump into the attack with knight c4. So the first idea is if white does nothing, we will support our knight playing b7, b5. So it forces bishop c4. And again, we want to support this time the pawn on c4 with b5. So this time it forces b5. And this position is okay for black. And we will follow with bishop a6, bishop b5, holding c6, holding also d3, and preparing a5, a4 later. Probably we will lose back d3, but in the rook endgame, this pawn on a5 is an asset, and I think the position is equal. With the pawn on a5 and the knight on d7, black is ready to fight the minority attack. How should white continue to play? So here, because black played g6, king g7 a bit too fast, white has the possibility to change his plan and try to play f3, e4 quite soon. And it will show that the king on g7 is a bit weak. And so I think here the solution is simply rook e1, f3. Probably we will have to play queen f2 to protect the pawn on d4, and then e4, e5, and create an attack against the black king. White is ready for b4, b5. How should black reply? So here, typically, we play b5, and the idea is to try to bring our knight to c4. So if we can achieve that, c6 will be covered forever, and we will have a very nice position. If white plays knight c5, we can also trade some pieces on c5 and then play bishop d7 to protect c6. I think in this case, white won't have any possibility to attack c6, and it will be also very good for black. But after a move like knight b2, we can simply protect c6 and then organize knight b6, knight c4. And this position is very, very easy to play for black. So now I will show you a game that I played against Ayman Rezouk, a grandmaster from Algeria, long time ago. And in this game we will see how my opponent used the move a5 to counter the minority attack. So the first moves are quite normal. And here my opponent starts the plan with knight f8, knight e6, g6, knight g7, bishop f5. We already saw this plan. And again, I think it's important to remember that in case you want to play with knight e6, it makes a lot of sense to do it without short castle. Before short castle, let's say. It's simply faster, and you don't need to play rook e8 to have the right to play knight f8. So it's a good move order. My opponent also postponed the move c6, also quite interesting. I think it has not no consequence in this position. But I was not aware of all that, and for me this position was already a critical moment. Generally in the opening, if you are surprised, you should see it as a critical moment and try to see if you can find a refutation or if you can punish your opponent. So here I should have developed normally, I think, knight f3 and then rook b1, b4. This position we saw already. Black is going to play g6, knight g7, bishop f5 to trade the bad bishop. But white is achieving the minority attack with b4, b5, so it's quite balanced. Another move order could be queen c2 first. It doesn't change much, except that white is able to play knight g2 instead of knight f3. Personally, I prefer to have the knight on f3 if I play for the minority attack, but I think knight e2 is also a possibility. So in the game, I played b4. So my idea that was that if black doesn't play c6, tactically b4 is possible, because now bishop takes b4 will lose a piece after queen f4 check. So black plays knight e6. Here it's quite logical to keep the bishop. A move like bishop f6, I think, is not very good on the long term. And so bishop h4, short castle. And now I made really a big mistake with queen b3. So the whole idea of b4 was to try to achieve the minority attack, saving the move rook b1, because when you play with rook b1 and a4, very often your opponent plays a6 and a b5 and wins the a file. So I thought maybe the refutation of my opponent's idea could be to achieve b5, keeping the a file. But here rook b1 will be a normal move, and I think we will transpose to something normal after c6, knight f3. So what's the problem of queen b3? Here my opponent played c6, and I think it's not the best move in the position. There is a very concrete way to try to exploit the strange move order from white with b4, queen b3, delaying the development on the king side. I think the best move is clearly a5. And now we see that we can simply jump into the attack instead of playing passively c6. So the idea is after b5, c5 is working. And here black saved the move c6. We already saw this idea of playing a5 and c5. But without c6, it's even stronger because it's simply faster. If I take on c6, c5 is coming anyway, and the queen is simply misplaced on b3. So this idea of combining a5 and c5 is very important. Here, of course, queen b3 is helping black. It will be much better for white to have castle instead of having played queen b3. So now the threat is c4, and if we take on c5, knight takes c5, attacking the queen, and the bishop is coming. So probably the best move is simply to accept the mistake and play queen d1 back. But now here, for example, black can take on d4, play bishop a6 to trade the bad bishop, and black is better developed and has nothing to fear. So in the game, my opponent played c6 first, and only now a5. So this typical breakthrough works again. Here I decided to take on b5 on f5. I was not sure of b5 because after b5, c5 is again possible, and this time white is not able to take en passant on c6 because black played c5 in 2 moves, c6 first and then c5. And this position is quite active for black. Here the knight on c5 is very active, rook c8 is coming. We can already say that the queen on c2 is again misplaced. So I didn't like this position and decided to instead to take on f5. And here rook f5 in the game was a bit, not passive, but a bit slow. I think a better try would be again the dynamical c5. And here white has to be careful. For example, here dc5, black has d4. Again, a very important idea. And after the trade, it's clear that the king on e1 is in danger. Queen c4 is holding, but in this position, I think even in endgame, in fact, black is more active. Bishop f6 is coming, and at any moment we can take the bishop pair, taking on g3. After bishop f6, rook b1, it's also difficult to play short castle with white because knight d2 fork is in the air. So this position is very active for black. And after c5, I think I would have played simply queen c2. And here, white is probably holding, but black has really nothing to fear. So the whole idea with b4, queen b3 was simply not working. So in the game, after rook f5, the position is not easy to access. I feel it's a bit more comfortable for white, but at the same time, I didn't find any way to apply pressure against b7. So it's probably about equal. So bishop d6, we already saw this idea of trading some minor pieces. So queen b3. Queen b3 is not very logical. Generally, when you try to apply pressure with the EV pieces, you hide the queen behind the rooks. So queen b3 is a bit is a bit strange here. But other ideas are not really working. The way to improve this position for white would be to bring a knight to c5. If a knight can come to c5, then b7 could start to be in danger. The problem is if we bring the kingside knight to c5, then the king is a bit alone. And for example, a move like knight h4 could already be dangerous. Followed by knight g4, knight takes e3, for example, knight takes f2. And when white defends on the king side, I think he can forget about bringing the knight to c5. For example, knight f1, and black has nothing to fear because both white knights are on the king side. So another idea could be to try to play maybe a5 and knight f4. But here, for example, bishop g4 is interesting. And then soon bishop g6. So trading the bishops. I think it's enough to hold. Maybe a better idea, a bit more tricky, would be simply to bring the knight f6 to d6. because on d6 the knight will protect b7 forever and could sometimes jump to c4. So a bit more active. So knight e8, knight d6. And here I don't see any way to apply pressure with white. An interesting idea is after knight f4, b5. And if black can follow with knight c4, c6 is forever covered, and f5 could become a weakness. So there is here a nice tactical variation. Black cannot, black doesn't fear losing c6 because rook c7 traps the queen. So the position is just okay for black, and in the game after queen b3, nothing happens, and in this position we agree to a draw. So I think this game was not very well played, but is quite interesting to understand the dynamic with a5 and c5 very fast. So black can, with this idea, fight for the initiative, even if white is playing the typical minority attack. So I think black has no problems here in the game. White has started the minority attack too early. How can black take advantage of this mistake? So here, it's important to play fast. If we follow with some normal moves like c6, rook e8 or g6, white will finish its development with knight f3 and short castle. So the solution here is to play a5, and after b5, c5. So black saves the move c6, because very often we have c6 followed by c5 in this sort of situation. But here c5 was played in one move, and here black is playing quite fast. So after the trade, c5 again, and the threat is c4 winning a piece. So black has to retreat. And I think this position is easily equal for black. cd4 followed by bishop a6 is already a good idea to improve the position. So black is okay. How can black at least equalize here? So here it's possible to play c5. I think it's a bit stronger than rook a5. After rook a5, short castle, and the position is quite comfortable for white. So c5 immediately seizes the initiative, I think. The first idea is if d c5, black can follow with d4. So d4 is very strong because now king e1 is a bit alone in the center. So it's still possible to survive with white with queen c4. And this endgame is more active for black. Bishop f6 is coming, and very often we will take the bishop pair, taking on g3. But also important is to see that if white plays with short castle, black has the idea bishop f6, knight d2 in some variations. So it's quite dangerous for white. I think dc5 was a mistake in this position, so it's better to play queen c2. But again, black has nothing to fear. It's possible to trade to win back a5, and the position is equal. Which piece should black improve here? So typically in the Carlsbad structure, a knight on d6 is quite good. And here the best move is knight e8, followed by knight d6. So it's a very effective way to protect the pawn on b7. And in some variations, it's even possible to jump to c4. So the knight on d6 is simply perfect here. So for example, after knight f4, b5 is interesting. And the idea is to play knight c4, being overprotected. And if knight b6, we can just sacrifice c6 because queen c6 will immediately lose after rook c7, dropping the queen. So important here is to find the maneuver knight e8, knight d6, and black is fine. Against the minority attack, black often waits with a7, a6, which goes well in combination with a knight on b6 or d6. Because in this case, we have concrete solutions against the push b4, b5. Don't worry, we will learn all that quite soon. But there are also many positions where the knight is simply on e6, and in this case, after b4, b5, the counter reaction c6, c5 is correct. With regards to this, b7, b6 is very useful to support c5 additionally. Compared with a7, a6, we can add that the pawn on b6 covers the squares c5, a5, and b6, which means that white can no longer prepare the minority attack with knight c5. That's a very important point. After the move a6, a knight on c5 is hard to chase because the move b6 would often lose, in this case, the pawn on a6. In the game Turkov-Galanov, we will also see that the configuration rook c8, bishop d7, knight e6 with pawns on a7, b6, c6 is a trustworthy fortress. So now let's discuss an interesting way to stop the minority attack. We will follow a correspondence game played between Turkov and Galanov. So white plays the exchange variation in the Queen's Gambit, and until now nothing happens. But here the move order is already very, very interesting. In fact, in this position, white has two main plans. He can play for the minority attack with b4, b5, or for the central pawn break with f3, e4. In both cases, we will adapt our play with our knight on d7. So typically, if b4 is coming, we will go to the queen side. We will probably play knight b6 at some point. If f3, e4 is coming, the knight has not so much to do on d7, and we will prefer to improve this knight going to e6. So probably knight f8, knight e6 to have some pressure against d4, because when white plays e4, the weak point becomes d4. So white here plays rook e1, and after knight f8, he goes back to b1. So this idea is very, very fascinating. White lost one move with the rook, playing rook b1 in two moves. But if black comes back to d7, he will have lost two moves. So, in fact, it could be a good way for white to win one move before playing b4, b5. But here black plays knight e6. So this knight on e6 is perfect against f3, e4, and is also quite good against b4, b5. So white's move order doesn't change much the evaluation. I think it's about equal. But what is the point of knight e6 against b4, b5? In fact, it's simply that the knight can support the counter c5. So after b4, black plays knight f6. It's important to play this move because in case we play c5, we want to first to protect d5. So the knight on f6 protects d5 and makes the pawn on c6 flexible. So for example, here b5 makes not so much sense because we counter with c5. And in this position, clearly the queen on c2 is misplaced. rook c8 is coming quite fast. So we will play bishop d7 or bishop e6 and then rook c8. And black has enough counterplay. So white played h3, bishop d7, a4, and now following this logic, rook c8. So now it's clear that black is ready for c5 at any moment, in fact. And the next move is also very, very important, b6. So many players here will play a6 without thinking too much. I think a6 is also playable. But here you could say that the square c5 is a bit weak, and also generally all the dark squares on the queen side. So b6, a5. So a6 is a bit passive, and I really prefer to wait with b6, because here we see that b6 covers c5 and a5 and will make c5 much stronger later. So it makes a lot of sense to wait like that. I think it's already a fortress. And of course, if b5 comes, we can always play c5, but sometimes we can also take on b5 and have some active play on the c file. So it will depend. It will depend of this situation. If cb5 is winning tactically, of course we play it, but as a rule we normally follow with c5, and it will be a very good equality. So in the game, white is not in a hurry to play b5. He's trying to improve his position. Queen a2, queen d6. So black could already stop to play almost and play queen e7, queen d6. I think it's very difficult for white to improve the position, but in the game, white tried with a5. Again, after b5, c5 is simply active, and black has nothing to fear. So a5 is maybe more interesting. Black played queen e7 again. An interesting idea is b5. So b5 seems a bit unlogical, because here we are not able to bring a knight to c4, but at the same time white is also not able to attack c6. So I think b5 is possible. But black played queen e7, and now he will try to develop some play on the king side. And here a draw was agreed. It's a bit early maybe, but the position is a bit frightening for white, because queen h4 with the idea knight g5 and a sacrifice on h3 could come very fast. So here the only move is knight f4. Of course the variation is not forced at all, but it's just to illustrate that black has no problems. For example, take, knight e6, queen f6. So on the queen side, white cannot do much. Here on the king side, it's quite complicated. For example, a positional sacrifice like f5 is possible. And here, black has an extra pawn, but cannot claim any advantage, because white's pieces are much better, in fact. But anyway, this situation is what we could call dynamical equality, and yeah, it's just possible. But in the game, yeah, after queen c1, it was a draw. Important is to see that even if white played a5, it cannot do much on the a file. So here AB6 is doing nothing. It's already difficult to play rook A1 because B4 is hanging. So this position is equal, and I think very important is to remember this fortress with B6, C6, rook C8, knight E6, waiting for B5 or A5, and nothing happens. White is ready for the B4, B5 breakthrough. How can black still consolidate the queen side? So here many players will play A6. I think it's playable, but I clearly prefer B6 because with this move we have a better control over C5 and A5, and in case white plays with B5 a bit too fast, we can always answer with C5. So B6 is supporting C5 in fact. And if white is playing A5, there is no threat, and we can even start to think about developing an attack on the king side. So here, for example, we can even wait with queen d6, and I think white is not able to enter on the queen side, and this position is simply equal. So now white takes on e7 and on e4. So now we have a different pawn structure. Instead of having a pure Carlsbad with c6 d5 against d4 e3, now we have a pawn on e4. It changes a lot of things, but basically for white the plan stays the same. He will try to create a minority attack with b4, b5. We saw the game Leko-Kramnik, and Leko here took on e4 instead of e7, and we analyze this position already. So now let's look at the game. So we want to overprotect e4. It's important because then all the pieces protecting e4 are free because e4 is overprotected, and it allows us to play on the king side with h5, h4. It can also free the knight f6 to allow later queen g5 and maybe a rook lift also to attack the king. So bishop a5 is quite automatic in this position. And now white plays b4. So here, very important, compared to the previous example, we have still the same idea. If white plays b5, we will try to react with c5. And here it will be an improved version, because after c5 we don't have an isolated pawn on d5. So in the Carlsbad, when you push c5, you need to be sure that d5 is not a weakness. But here, because the pawn is already on e4, if we can answer to b5 with c5, we have no problems in the center. We even gain the center, because when we trade the c pawn for the d pawn, then the center remains with e4 against e3, and e4 is more active than e3, takes more space, and because of that I think black would have a better position. So here we play rook c8. So very logical. If b5 happens, it's very easy to answer with c5. And now we have an interesting question. a7 is under attack, and we have the choice between b6 and a6. In the game, black played b6. I think it's clearly the best move. For an engine, a6 is also playable, but here we see that if we play a6, we lose all the dark squares. So c5, b6, a5. And even if I don't know exactly how concretely white can exploit that, probably preparing a4, b5 anyway. But it's probably not so dangerous also. I much prefer the move in the game, b6. So here we can still defend this position. But we have always to calculate knight c5. We need to be sure that white cannot develop some play on the queen side. So b6 was played, and now we see the difference. We control a lot of squares on the queen side, and I think it's not so easy for white to play. So here, very logical h5. And now, in the game Sivka Kolbiaza, black made a small mistake with rook e d8. I think this move is not necessary. The priority is to attack on the king side, and because of that, knight d5 is already possible. So for example, if white takes on c6, it's over because of bishop d7 with a pin. If b5 is quite interesting, then we take, and we can even play the endgame, because after the trades, in fact we have the c file, and the problem is if white takes on e4, we enter. So here there is a nice tactic, f5 followed by knight c3, rook c1, and a fork with knight e2. But excepted that, for example, if white plays rook b2, we don't win tactically, but positionally, we have more space in the center. I think the bad bishop is not bad at all in this endgame. It's also something interesting to understand. With more space, white knights have less squares, and because of that, our bishop has more possibilities. Here, for example, we will easily push the pawn majority on the queen side. We will play b5, a5, b4, and this pawn majority is quite far from king g1, and I think it will be quite easy to support these pawns, and the bishop will play a big role here. So with more space in the center, the bishop is gaining in value. And also on the long term, g2, h3 could become some targets. If we are able to play later bishop b5, bishop f1, if white activates his king, for example. So this position is better for black. Important is to have the control of the c file. We will see later a variation where white has the control of the c file, and it changes a lot the evaluation. And here, if white plays knight c3, we can simply start the attack with g5. The king will have to move to the side, probably king h7, then rook g8, and g4 is coming. So I think knight d5 was, in this position, the best way to play. The fastest way to develop the attack, simply. So rook d8 loses some time, and white loses also some time with rook c2. Here it's important to open as fast as possible on the queen side. In fact, this position is a race, and white should hurry up to avoid the attack on the king side. So b5, and when we take, now the difference is we didn't play knight d5, and we cannot win the c file with black here. So for example, knight d5, rook takes. The rook cannot take back because d5 will be hanging. So bishop c8, and now rook c1, white has a c file, and it's a compensation for the extra space from black. So this position is about equal. So with f3, white has some counterplay, and I think it's okay for white. There was a nice variation. Here, instead of queen b3, white could take on c8 and take on d5. And with some activity here, white compensates the loss of an exchange. So I think this position is quite, in practice, it's quite nice for white because black's king is clearly weaker than the white one. And h4 is weak. There are some ideas with knight e7 check and then queen g4, queen h4 checkmate. So I would prefer to be white in this position. So even if an engine will say it holds, I think in this position, to play rook takes e8 is not very good. I would prefer to play queen b3 simply and accept that the position is simply balanced and not better for black. So in the game, white played rook c2 in this position, and now knight d5 is again possible. And here we have an interesting situation. The question is, what is the best way to attack on the king side? We have always two possibilities. We can attack very fast with the pieces, play something like queen g5, rook d6, rook g6. So here we will try to attack without pushing the g pawn. And of course, the other solution is to play something like g5, king h7, rook g8, and then g4. So it's a bit slower, but at the end it's probably stronger. So here the move queen g5 in the game is not very precise. Black should play g5, and in this position, even if white is able to trade a rook, he stays with a bad knight on d2 because the knight has absolutely no hope to find a good square. And the c-file is not very important in this case because when white tries to take the c-file, we can always play rook, bishop e6, rook g8, g4, and bishop e6 will hold f7 and d5, and g4, queen g5 is coming. So I think this position is better for black. But in the game, queen g5 was played, and here white should simply play king h1, because the first idea of queen g5 is to take on h3. So it makes a lot of sense to avoid that with king h1. And then take on d5 and try to open the c-file. a7 is also hanging in some variations. But white took on d5. And now black will have some attack. Important is to see that bishop h3 immediately doesn't work. Because after bishop g2, white doesn't take back because of h3, followed by queen g2, but simply plays king h2. And rook g1 is coming, and black doesn't have any attack. So here cd5 is a good move, like in the game. And now take, rook c8. And a difficult move to find because when you are attacking, you don't want to go backward, but here it's the best move. Queen f6. And here the next move is queen c6 and queen c2. So white is almost losing, I think. And the main idea is if white fights for the c-file, after rook c1 we have a check, and we win b4. So the game is over, and I think it was a good example again of staying flexible with b6. And in this game, black has very good chances, and I think the position is simply easy to play for black. What is the best way for black to defend a7? So here we have the choice between b6 and a6. a6 is possible but very passive. With this move, it's clear that we are weak on the dark squares. I mean c5, b6, a5. And temporarily we can stop b5, but at some point white will try to organize f4, b5 later. So here I clearly prefer to play b6. because now we control many squares on the 5th rank, and if white plays b5, c5 will come stronger because b6 will support c5. And if white is trying to increase the pressure on the queen side, we can start the attack on the king side. So this position is totally okay for black. And it's important to remember that c6, b6 are controlling many squares. And here we are clearly not afraid of b5 because of this counter with c5. What is the best move for black here? So here important is at some point to attack on the king side with the queen. And I think the best move is clearly knight d5. And then we will play for g5, g4, rook g8 after moving the king to the h file, and then queen g5. So knight d5 is the start of the attack on the king side. There is a game, Sivka Kolbiaza, where black played rook e8 and then play knight d5, but I think this move is unnecessary and it's much better to start with knight d5. White cannot take on c6 because of bishop d7 and the pin wins some material. A move like knight c3 is possible, but then we start the attack with g5. We are not afraid of knight takes d5 because after c takes d5 we improve our pawn structure and we have still a better endgame. And after b5, we take on b5, and with queen d7, we again play for the endgame. And I think if white takes on d7, we can try to push the pawns on the queen side. We have a pawn majority, and we will defend the pawn on e4 with f5. And simply, we have already more space in the center, and white's knights, they don't have really good squares, so this position is better for black. The queen side is stabilized. What's the next move? So here, it's time to attack with g5. I think a move like queen g5 is not optimal, because even if it's very fast to play rook d6, rook g6, the problem is white can always play a little move like king h1, avoiding bishop h3 first, and then in case g2 is really weak, rook g1, and without g5, g4, I think it's not possible to checkmate white. So clearly better will be here g5, king moves to the h file, king h7, and white has to trade some pieces, because if white doesn't take on d5, we are going to play on the g file very fast with g4, queen g5, and so on, or rook g8 first, after protecting d5, obviously. So probably queen e6 and then rook g8. And if white takes on d5, then we have a better endgame, because the knight on d2 is completely passive. It's also a good point of playing b6. Here, after knight b3, the squares c5 and a5 are under control, and there is no hope for the knight on d2 to find a good square. So I think this position is also better for black. As a player, I have always believed that flexibility is an important practical advantage. Actually, in a position where you have several options, it's hard for your opponent to keep a good overview of the situation, and that increases definitely their chances of making a mistake. Against the minority attack, the configuration with the a pawn on a6, with a knight on b6 if possible, is clearly the most flexible. In this case, black has three active responses. First, to play b7, b5, then there is no minority attack anymore, but in this case, c6 becomes also a backward pawn. Or to play a takes b5, followed by the push c6, c5, with some counterplay in the center, but white will create also an isolated pawn on d5 after d takes c5. Or the last possible response, to play c takes b5 and then the push a6, a5, creating a useful passed pawn for later. Of course, the trick is knowing when to play which. When black plays b7, b5, it's like when a poker player stands up at the table and loudly announces, "I'm all in." After this move, you simply can't go back. The pawn on c6 will forever be backward, and the question is whether black can protect it. In practice, black almost always tries to achieve this with a knight jump to c4, which is easy to achieve with a knight already on d6. With a knight on d7, the task is more difficult because white could simply play a4, a5 to prevent knight b6, knight c4. Something also to remember, the option e3, e4 to find counterplay in the center is also an important idea for white. In this case, the stability of the knight on c4 could be severely tested. So now let's have a look at the game Nikolic against Kramnik. Kramnik will show us how to play b5 against the minority attack. And I think this game is particularly impressive, especially because both players played blindfold. And I think Kramnik made just one mistake, and a quite difficult one. So let's see how Kramnik did that. So the opening was not very challenging. Against the Semislav, CD5 is not very strong because in this position, instead of having a knight on f3, white should have played e3 to be able to play bishop d3 as fast as possible, and the goal for white is to prevent bishop f5. So here, because of knight f3, black has enough time to play bishop f5, and I think this position is already equal. So now we have a typical situation where black has to decide between waiting passively with a6, knight b6, or taking some space with a5. So looking at many games of Kramnik, I noticed that he prefers in general to play f5. So it's already quite interesting. With f5, of course, you cannot reach the best configuration anymore. You cannot have a pawn on a6 and a knight on d6. So it means it will be a different game and also a different plan for black. We are not just trying to reach this setup, but a5 takes some space and has also some advantages. So here knight e4. Anyway, we want to trade some pieces, like after a6, in fact. And now how to react to this minority attack. It's very tempting to take first on b4 and then start to think. It will be probably a small mistake. Here Kramnik decided to play b5. So what's the difference between b5 immediately and a b4 first? For example, if we try to bring the knight to c4 quite fast, here white cannot really play b5 because of rook a3. Rook a3 is anyway the threat in this position, but not immediately because of knight takes d5. So if we play, for example, here rook c1, we take on c3 because rook a3 will be a blunder after knight takes d5. And if we take the queen on d3, he takes our queen on e7. And if we take the knight, he takes the rook on a3. So it's important for black to be aware of that. But it's anyway an important idea because here, for example, we play knight c4. b5 is again not possible because of knight a3. This time we have a fork and we win the pawn. But white here could fight back for the a file, and that's the reason why taking on b4 is not very precise. Here rook a1 is enough to have equality. So I much prefer the move of Kramnik because playing b5 immediately, he doesn't give the chance to trade rooks on a1. So here queen c2, the idea is to take on e4. Here white cannot take on e4 because of d takes e4 with a fork. So he has to play queen c2 first. And now, quite interesting, Kramnik decides to take on b4. So reaching almost the previous position. But white had to play queen c2. So why not to keep the tension and play something like knight d6, going to c4 first, attacking a3 with seemingly some initiative. The reason is white could free his position with the move a4. So a4 is a dynamical possibility, bringing a different position. And black has no real pressure on the queen side anymore. After knight c4, queen b3, take a4, queen f4. And here, this position is about equal. An interesting variation is knight b6, queen c6. Queen c6 is very important because if white decides to just to hold passively, a4 is coming, and this a pawn is an asset for black. So queen c6, rook c8, and here the variation is quite complicated. But I think white is okay, even if black is an exchange up. The problem is black has no pawns on the queen side anymore, and if the wall play happens on one side, the knight is not much weaker than the rook. So the problem of the knight is this piece cannot go very fast to the other side of the board. But here it's not the case, and the knight on f3 is very stable. White has a better pawn structure, and even if he loses back a5, I think this position is about equal. So Kramnik probably understood that and decided to take on b4 first, and then bring a knight to c4. Here, it's a position where black doesn't want to trade one knight. It's an exception because we know since chapter 1 with the 7 concepts that normally black is going to trade a lot of pieces and keep one knight. Here, it's an exception because the knight on c3 is dominated. After having played b5, we see that knight c3 cannot go to a4, cannot support the pawn break b4, b5, and because of all that, the knight on c3 becomes a bad piece. So there is no reason to trade this strong knight on e4, and Kramnik played knight d6. Now knight b6. So also something very important to understand, in this position, white is struggling to find counterplay. And if we put the wrong knight on c4, with knight c4 immediately, white finds a typical pawn break in this pawn structure e4. And now it's not the same game. White has some counterplay, and knight c4 could become a bit shaky if black has to trade his d5 pawn, because then white will play for d4, d5, and at some point knight c4 will be unstable. So knight b6 keep the wall control, and I think it's an important point. So rook c8, knight d3, knight bc4. So here we have a perfect setup. Knight on c4 is active. Knight on d6 is preventing the break e4. And now Kramnik understands that because the queen side is so well under control, it's time to play on the king side. So he finds rook e8, preventing the pawn break e4 and also creating some sacrifice ideas on e3 later. And now he plays what we very often saw already, h5 and a kingside attack. So rook b1, probably a good idea is to bring a knight to f4, so knight d3, knight f4, and this knight on f4 will help to make the king side secure. So rook b1 is also quite logical. White wants to trade EV pieces on the a file, because when you are under attack, to trade pieces is very often the solution. The problem is Kramnik is already gone, and the a file is empty. So that's why rook b1, rook a1, and now rook a2. It takes too much time, and it's not working. So here, Kramnik, playing blindfold, finds the sacrifice knight takes e3 again. And here he commits maybe the only mistake in the game, but I think many players will have done the same. He played queen h4, attacking f2 and d4, so it seems a strong move. But white has a way to hold after that. The engine suggests queen g3, and it makes a big difference, because now in many variations it's possible to take on g2, and also queen g3 applies pressure against c3. So for example here, knight take g2, if rook takes, rook e1 is winning, so the queen on g3 is also taking away the square h2. So here the game is over, because white cannot play king h2. And after knight f6, knight f4 is winning. If rook takes, black wins some material. So now white cannot save the knight on e8. Or if he plays rook e1, he loses the knight on c3. So after knight e2, we can take rook g3. So the whole variation is forced. Check, take. And this position should win quite easily, because black has already 5 pawns for the piece. b4 is not very healthy too, and I think it's difficult to play with the knight on d6. So the knight will never become active, and black should win that technically. So in the game, after queen h4, knight takes. Here the only way to save the game is king g1. So it's a prophylactic move, and allowing to play later knight e2. So it's impossible to understand in front of the board, I think. So here, king g1, knight f5, knight e2. And it holds tactically. In the game, after rook f1, knight f5, it's not possible to play knight e2 because of rook takes e2 and knight g3 with a very strong fork. Also, it's too late for king g1 because king g1, queen takes b4, and black accumulates the pawns, and white knights are also in danger, so the game is over. So after rook f5, Kramnik finishes the game with rook e8 and rook d1. So Nikolic resigns here because after take, queen f2 and queen g2 checkmate. So the game was almost perfectly played by Kramnik, and I find this game very, very impressive. What is the best way for black to fight against the minority attack? So here we have the choice between b5, stopping the minority attack, or a b4, opening the a file. The move of Kramnik in the game was b5. I think it's clearly the best one. A b4 is interesting, but doesn't bring any winning chance. So because white here can play rook a1 and trade some pieces, and it will be about equal. Important is to see that b5 is losing because of knight a3. So even with this move a takes b4, the minority attack is neutralized, but the move of Kramnik is anyway much better. So b5, and only now a b4. So it's a better position for black because we force the move queen c2, and queen c2 is not very useful for white because soon we will have a knight on c4 and c6 is anyway covered. The plan with b5 worked out. The a file belongs to black and c6 is not in danger. What is still missing? So in this position, to improve, we need to improve our pieces. We need to bring knight d7 to c4, and clearly the move is knight b6. Why not to play knight c4 immediately? In this case, in fact, knight d7 is not very useful, and white is able to freeze position with the pawn break e4. So it's important to understand that in this pawn structure, when we play b5, we want to jump to c4, and we want also to prevent the move e3, e4. So that's why Kramnik played knight b6 in the game, and knight d6 controls e4, knight b6 is going to c4. So first we protect c6, and then knight bc4, and black's position is a bit better, I think. Black forgot to capture on b4. How can white take advantage of this mistake? So here, white has an interesting dynamical possibility with a4. It will be a way to get rid of the pressure on the queen side, and I think it equalizes simply. So knight b6, not the only move, but a good one. And here white should take on c6. Queen b3 is not good because of a4, and now the pawn on a4 is clearly an asset for black. So queen takes c6, and now we have some unbalance, but the point is, even if black is an exchange up, and even if he will win the pawn a5, the knight on f3 is not bad here, and white has a good pawn structure, so one pawn and a knight will be enough compensation for the exchange. I think this position should be a draw. So now let's have a look at a rapid game showing another example of playing b5 against the minority attack. I think this game is very instructive because there are some mistakes, and we will learn a lot from these mistakes. So c4, first move, and then we reach a queen's gambit. So h3 is a very good move. Here black played knight f8, And it would be simple to play short castle. I think it's objectively the best move. But white decided to play bishop f4. So in this case, h3 is also useful, because in case of knight e6, white is able to save the bishop. There is anyway a good plan for black in this position. It's to trade the dark squared bishop later. So here, clearly the way to play is to trade on d3 and then play bishop d6. So I think this position is not a real advantage for white, even if white is able to create the weakness on c6. In fact, it's very difficult to apply pressure against c6, because if you play a move like knight e5, white doesn't really attack c6 several times, and c5 is always possible for black. So normally the usual method is to apply pressure on the c file and then move the knight c3 to a4 and probably going to c5. But here white doesn't control the a file, so knight a4 is impossible. And even if it was possible, for example, if the queen was on c2, after knight a4, black could always react with knight e4, and the square c5 will be very well protected. And then c5 will come. So I think it's very difficult here to apply pressure. What is missing is probably the control of the a file. So I think the a file is generally underrated in this sort of position. We will see this topic later in the game. So here, black made the mistake of pushing b5 immediately. So now knight e5, rook c8, and because black is forced to play rook c8, we can already see that potentially the a file is lost. So the next moves are quite normal. And here already a critical decision, how to take back, with the queen or with the knight. In the game, Baldaov with white took back with the queen. So remember, it was a rapid game, so many moves were played too fast. So it seems logical to take back with the queen to keep the pressure against e6 with the knight on e5. But in fact, knight d3 is much stronger, and the difference is having a knight on d3, we can protect b4, and protecting b4, we can play rook a1 and rook a6 very, very fast. So it was here important to take this a file as fast as possible. So then we play rook a1, we take on b5 and rook a6. And we will attack c6 from the 6th rank and from the c file. So it will be much stronger than in the game. But white took back with the queen. And here also a critical moment. How do we take back, with the pawn or with the bishop? White took with the bishop in the game, but I think with the pawn, it introduces a very interesting idea. Knight e2, knight d4. And what is interesting, if you compare this game with the previous one between Nikolic and Kramnik, the difference is the quality of the knight for black. I mean, knight g7 has nothing to do on the king side, and if you play knight g7, you try to trade pieces with bishop f5, it's a good idea, but you shouldn't play also b5, because b5 is playing on the other side of the board, and the knight cannot participate. So here we see clearly that knight g7 will never reach the square c4, and that's why also d5 is a good move, because the pawn on e5 now takes away the square d6. So it's impossible to play knight f5, knight d6, knight c4. So this position is clearly advantageous for white. Knight d4 is coming, and then white will attack c6 a third time with rook c3, queen c2 probably, and it will be very difficult to protect the pawn. Knight g7 is simply out of play. So bishop takes e5, not very good. And here f6 is a blunder, but the refutation is difficult to find. ab5 will be the solution. And here, very important, black has to solve two problems, the weakness on c6 and the knight on g7. So the solution is to bring the knight to c4, and it solves both problems. So knight d6, going to c4, white is forced to take. And now we have an interesting situation. Knight against good bishop. Of course, c6 is difficult to cover because no knight will go to c4, but at the same time it's also difficult to activate this knight for white. It's clear that if the knight reaches c5, black will take on c5, and then with the 3 EV pieces will be able to protect c6 against 3 other EV pieces. And what is important is that the knight never really reaches e5. So the bishop on d6 controls e5 and prevents knight e5. Also, this bishop attacks b4. So when white wants to attack 3 times c6 with his EV pieces, he's probably losing the pawn on b4. So it's quite difficult here to do something with white. I think this position is simply equal. So it was a solution for black to take back simply with the a pawn and then try to improve the knight. So in the game, f6 was played, and white reacted quite automatic with bishop f4. Positionally, a normal move, but tactically here bishop f6 was working, and then ba6. And the point is, white has already 3 pawns for the piece and can develop some play with b5. So black has no time to secure the position with knight d6. For example, after cb5, queen takes, d5 is also lost. Or black plays knight e7, but then black is simply unable to move. And probably the plan for white here is to play knight b5, knight c7, winning some material. Rook b5, knight takes d5 will win also d5, but I think knight b5, knight c7 makes more sense. And after queen b6, the same idea, the a pawn is quite strong. For example, after rook e8, knight b5, and it's difficult to win this pawn. And knight c7 wins some material. And after knight d6, there is a tactic with knight d5, take, rook b8. So the idea is to promote. Queen e2 is possible, and here queen b3 is working very well, because in this position it's clear that the endgame is won for white. If white has, in this sort of endgame, rook against bishop and knight, if white has 2 extra pawns, it's a fight. It can be sometimes draw, sometimes won, but with 3 pawns it's quite easily won. Because even if black sacrifices a piece for 2 pawns, then white has again an extra pawn plus an extra exchange, and it will be soon over. So it was a beautiful variation, but white played bishop f4, and here white understood the position quite well. Here it's clear that black has a bad knight on g7, but white has also a passive knight on c3, because this pawn structure b5, c6, d5 simply dominates the knight. So white played knight e2 in order to improve the knight, and knight f5 is probably a small mistake. here the priority is to fight back for the a file and to play queen d7. So now white will protect b4, making rook a1 possible, but black is able to fight back with rook a8. So it's an improvement compared to the game. And after knight f5, queen b3. So now white is able to play rook a1, and black cannot play rook a8 because c6 will be hanging in this case. Also something interesting, if black tries to trade the bishops to be able then to play knight d6, knight c4, here there is a tactic rook c6, and queen d5 is winning. So king g7 to avoid this tactic with rook c6, but now white plays rook a1 and will take the a file. So probably the best defense is to fight back for the file. Queen d7, rook a6, queen b7, and rook a8. And white has still a bit of initiative, but black is able to hold. And in the game, bishop d6 is simply much too slow, and it's soon over. Rook a6, queen c3. So the idea is to take on d6 and on c6. After bishop f4, the problem is black is too slow to achieve knight d6, knight c4, because c6 is already hanging. So knight e7 to protect c6, and then knight d3 with a very comfortable edge. Now black can forget about playing knight c4, and with this passive knight on e7 and knight c5 coming, I think white has a good advantage. And knight e7 immediately, rook a1. And this position is very easy to play with white. Here simply knight c5, and I think technically the position is won. The king on f7 is a bit weak. An idea for white is, for example, to play queen b3 and then e4, and suddenly play in the center to open the position. If the king moves, probably there is, after d4, a fork on e6. So it's not so easy for black to react when white plays e4. And I think this position is much better for white, or almost technically won. What is the way to equalize? So I think here in this position, a move like b5 makes not so much sense, because the knights on the king side are not really able to reach c4 fast, and because of that c6 becomes a weakness. So here it's much better to trade pieces. So take on d3, then bishop d6. Of course, the drawback of that is that white is able to push b5. But at the same time, because we were able to trade pieces, c6 is not very weak, and also very important is that black controls the a file. And this position without the rooks, for example, would be easily equal, because c5 would be very easy to play. And here, white cannot really attack c6 easily. There is not the possibility to play knight f4, for example, for white. So rook c1, knight f4, knight c5 is not possible. So rook on a8 is quite good, and the advantage is simply minimal. What is the best way for white to recapture? So here, queen d3 was played in one game, but after knight d7, I think black is more or less okay. Here it's much better to take with a knight, And the difference is that because b4 is now very well protected, white will be able to invade the a file with rook a1, a takes b5, rook a6. So now it will be much easier to attack c6 because the rook on a6 will apply pressure, and also the other EV pieces on the c file. And this position is better for white. How can black improve their position? So here clearly the priority is to bring the knight to c4, and black should play knight f5. So if the knight reaches c4, c6 will be covered and the position will be very nice for black. So after knight d6, white has to take on d6, and this position is very interesting. I think it's completely equal because even if theoretically a knight is better than a bishop in this position, we can say that bishop d6 applies pressure against b4, so white cannot attack so easily with 3 EV pieces the pawn on c6. And if white brings the knight to d3 to protect b4, then bishop d6 is dominating him, and in case of bishop e5 or bishop c5, it's possible to take this knight and then use a passive defense of c6 with the 3 EV pieces. So something like rook e6, queen d7, rook c8, and then black will wait and shouldn't lose this game. So the position is simply equal. If white manages to play b4, b5, there are two active responses for black. Either c6 takes b5 followed by a5, or a takes b5 followed by c5. We will analyze these two options with a lot of examples. Sometimes the solution is still not easy to find because black is able to play both answers, and then the decision will be quite interesting to take. We should also remember that a passive response with only a b5 is very often possible. Then white will have b takes c6, and after b takes c6, the pawn will be backward. But we already know that this situation is not very dangerous. If we own the a file, if we are able to cover c6 playing knight c4, or simply if we can trade the EV pieces or free our position with c6, c5. So black has many possibilities, and I think when we understand the position, it's possible to fight. So after c takes b5, a takes, and a5, important is the control of the c file. Very good is also a knight on b6. It prevents white to play b5, b6, what would separate our 2 pawns on the queen side, b7 and a5. And a knight on b6 is very strong, defending d5 and sometimes jumping to c4, and also simply supporting the a pawn in case we want to push a4. Something important to remember is that this a pawn can be a very good asset in endgame. So I think this method of play is very good. Unfortunately, not always possible. And in case of AB c5, I think in this pawn structure, black needs active pieces after the trade on c5, because d5 will be isolated. Again, a knight on b6 can be very helpful to protect d5, and also to use the square c4 again sometimes. In white's usual configuration with the queen on c2 and the knight on c3, we can say that black finds very often some initiative on the c file, because the pawn on b5 weakens the knight on c3. And a pawn on b2 will be in this position much better than on b5. And in some endgames, b5 can also become a target. And I think in general, b5 compensates for our weakness on d5. So this method is also very good. So now I will show you one game that I played about 20 years ago against Anatoly Weiser, a good friend of mine. Anatoly was 30 years ago one of the best players in the world in rapid chess, and he had a lot of success, and he was about 2,600 Elos. And I think this game was almost perfectly played from him, not from me. And we will analyze how he managed to fight against the minority attack with b4, b5. So Anatoly plays the French also. That's why he started with e6, avoiding my Trompowsky, and also some other variations like the London system, or I think e6 is a good move order if you play the Queen's Gambit and the French. And now we have an exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit. So here g6, 20 years ago, the good plan in this position was not well known. And I played rook b1, I think already a small mistake. Here, the best way to play is bishop h6. And after knight e6, black clearly shows his intention to play knight g7 and bishop f5. And the right way to react here is knight e5 and now g4. So quite astonishing, but the point is here black cannot achieve his goal. He cannot play bishop f5, and suddenly the knight on g7 is very passive. And this position is clearly better for white. I think the plan is to prepare f4, f5. And I don't see how black can organize some counterplay in this position. So my move rook b1 is not good enough. So black plays knight e6. And here again another mistake. Bishop takes f6. At the time I was a bit young and I did not understand this pawn structure. Bishop f6 is something that you can see in many games of Anatoly Karpov, but he's an exception. He's one of the only top players giving his bishop so easily for the knight, and I think in this position is particularly wrong. I should play something like bishop h4 or bishop h6. But yeah, the position is about equal already, I think. And bishop f6 is really a mistake, because even if it gives the impression that the minority attack will work faster, the bishop pair is very important here for black. And in this position, already Anatoly shows that he understands the plans perfectly. Queen d6, a very strong move, taking the control of many dark squares, and also showing that after b5, it's possible to answer with c5. So here I started to understand that it won't be so easy to push b5. So I played rook c1, quite neutral. I think this move is not helping much, but the problem is b5 is not working. So here we have our topic. Black has a choice between ab5, c5, and cb5, ab5, a5. So it's a position where it's important to react in a good way, because cb5 will be here a mistake. So now, of course, we would like to play b6, and after bishop d7 or bishop b7, we will control all the entry squares on the c file. So it will be okay for black. The problem is white is able to play b6 first, and now b7 and a5 are not working together anymore. I think the knight on e6 is also passive, and d5 is a target, knight b5 is in the air, so this position is better for white. So even if with bishop c6 we can protect d5 easily, now bishop b5 is a key move to trade the defender, and this position is better for white. But I'm sure Anatoly would have played in this position, would have played a b5 and then c5. And now we see that the knight on e6 makes a lot of sense. So very often you find the right way to play looking at your knight. If the knight is on e6, it's clear that c5 makes a lot of sense, because the knight supports the pawn and already attacks d4. If the knight is on b6, then b5, b6 is not possible for white, and because of that, cb5 followed by a5 is very often the solution. So if you look at your knight, he almost tells you the solution. So here, knight takes, and this position is clearly good for black. The problem is bishop on f6 is very strong, and c3 is not well protected. We already discussed this point, but when the pawn is on b5, the problem is c3 is simply unprotected. So it's quite easy to develop some play with rook c8, rook a3, and attack the knight. And also indirectly the queen behind the knight. So the pawn will be on b2. This type of position will be probably a bit better for white. So now, for example, I mean, it's just an example. I think many moves are possible, but this position is a bit more active for black. I think here it's again an example where b5 could become a weakness. So black rooks are clearly more active, and I think the next move is probably queen b4, attacking b5, preparing rook a2. So this position is just a bit better for black for sure. So I didn't push b5 and played rook c1, so I don't take the decision. Here bishop d7 is completely normal. Probably knight g5 is a bit more precise, but it's extremely difficult to understand. Knight g5 comes later in the game, and bishop d7 allows white to play h4. So h4 is completely counterintuitive. I didn't want to play h4, and I think I even didn't consider it. But it's probably the best move for white because h4 prevents knight g5. And then we can support the pawn with g3, probably safely. I think white can play h4, g3 in this position. And in case black tries to attack on the king side, we have always knight e2, knight f4. And I think white can consolidate a sort of fortress on the king side here. So h4 would have been very precise. I played queen b3 with the idea that if I play b5, I want to prevent c5 attacking d5 another time. But here Anatoly shows a great understanding and plays knight g5, because knight f3 is the only defender on the king side, and it's important to remove this knight. And here I played rook e1, so again a passive move. Knight e2, I think black would have played bishop d8. So that's why Anatoly played knight g5. He wants to trade knight f3 and then try to checkmate with bishop c7 and queen h2. So knight f4, bishop c7. Now a move like h4 is a bit dangerous because h6, g5 is coming. And here we have again a fianchetto knight on g2 this time, and it's always a bit suspicious. And I think here black will open the h file, forcing the trade on g5, and after king g7, rook h8, white is in big troubles. Probably queen d1 will be better, but this position is also very active for black, so I think the knight on h5 is a bit shaky, and yeah, this position is just... the problem is white cannot really open the queen side. So a move like b5 doesn't do anything. So here black will develop some play on the king side. So I played rook e1, and here bishop d8, a very important move. So now we see that bishop c7, queen h2 is a threat. And white has an interesting decision because it's possible to play active with e4 or to continue to play for the fortress with a move like knight e2, like in the game. Interesting is to understand why e4 is not as strong as it seems. Because in fact, after e4, bishop b6, and e4 is just weakening the pawn on d4. So for example, after ed, rook e1, bishop d4, and if white takes on c6, bishop takes c6, and the two bishops are very dangerous. And if e5, now the problem is d4 is hanging, and after knight e2, black opens just on time with f6. Because f4 is not possible. Black could take 2 times on e5, and bishop b6 is simply pinning the pawn on d4. After f4, f e5, and rook e5. And after a move like b5, take, rook b8, and white cannot develop some initiative. If white takes on c6, bc6, and bishop b6 is protected. And this position is better for black. So I had again a reason to play passive and play knight e2. Bishop c7, knight g3, h5, a typical move that we saw already several times. When the queen side and the center are under control, it makes a lot of sense for black in the Karlsbad to take space and attack with the h-pawn. King g7, rook h8, also quite typical. I think black will play h4, probably g5, g4, or maybe rook h5. So to bring the rook to the attack makes a lot of sense. Here I decided to open the position with b5. I know it's not very strong, but I wanted to find some counterplay at some point. And another move could be to wait a bit more. But here bishop b8 is really annoying, because then when white plays b5, it's possible to take and to play a5. So next move, if white doesn't push b6, next move black will push b6. And all the entry squares on the c file are controlled after a move like b6. So it's important to try to create some imbalance on the queen side with b6 for white, but now rook c8, take b6, take d5, and this position is complicated. Objectively, black is better, but it's possible to fight. So I'm not sure this move wouldn't be better than the game, in fact. But here, the knight on f1 is a bit out of play. The pawn on f5 can run very fast. I'm not sure white is able to activate his pawn majority in the center. And the bishop pair in an open position is for sure very dangerous. But it was also possible to play like that. So b5. After b5, a takes b5, and here it's clearly a mistake even if it seems quite logical. I think that's the only real mistake of Anatoly in this game, AB5. The solution is this time CB5. So we see that very often black has a choice between both possibilities, AB or CB, and each position is different. In practice, you have to not to think too dogmatic. You have simply to look at the position and try to decide concretely. Each position is different. So yes, CB5 is a solution, followed by A5. Again, black would like to follow with B7, B6 to close the queen side and have the control of all the entry squares on the C file. So it forces B6 for white. And this position is surprisingly completely okay for black, because tactically black holds his A pawn, and I think black has simply the advantage with the bishop pair plus a passed pawn. It would have been the way to play for black. And instead of that, after AB, in fact, now white is able to create a backward pawn on C6. So BC6 was played. I think a move like bishop C6 is not better, because now white will play bishop B5. So it's difficult to take on B5 because D5 and B7 will be weak and isolated. And if white is able to take on C6, then there is again a backward pawn on C6. So bishop takes C6 is not the way to avoid the pawn weakness. So Anatoly played BC6, rook A1. So here we might draw several moves later. The idea is white is able to trade the VPCs, and on the king side it's a fortress, and I think draw is a normal result. But the plan played by Anatoly in the game was very instructive. I think Kasparov played the same plan against Akopian long time ago in a blitz game. So the idea is queen d6, knight g5 to trade the defender on f3, and then bishop d8, bishop c7, with ID queen h2. And if white defends passively like in the game, it's very often possible to push the pawns on the king side and develop an attack. So it shows exactly why to give the bishop, as I did on f6, was a mistake. And I think this game is quite instructive. How can black further improve their control over the dark squares? So here the move is queen d6. We control e5, c5. We also make sure that after b5 we are able to react with c5. So this position is good for black. White has managed to get in the breakthrough b4, b5. How must black react now? So here we have the choice between ab5 and cb5. The good move is ab5. If we play cb5, followed by a5, the problem is white is just on time to play b6. And in this position, black is under pressure, because it's difficult to protect d5, to fight for the c file, and to protect a5 at the same time. So a rook is missing, and white has the advantage. But after ab5, followed by c5, black has a very active position. And here, black has the initiative on the queen side, and the position is probably a bit better for black. What is the best plan for black here? So here, black should try to attack on the king side, and the best way to do that is to first to trade the defender on f3 with knight g5, and after the trade, bishop d8, followed by bishop c7, with the idea of entering on h2 with the queen. And we see that bishop d7 and bishop c7 are targeting the king side, and this position is better for black. How must black proceed in this typical situation? So here again, we have the choice between cb5 and ab5. The move is cb5. A move like ab5 is not good enough. It was what happened in my game against Anatoly Weiser. The problem is white is able to create the backward pawn on c6 after bc6. Interesting is that bishop c6 is not really helping because bishop b5, and after the trade on c6, black will have to protect a weak pawn. So after bc6 immediately, rook a1, rook c1, and at some point white will be able to trade the EV pieces, and black has not the possibility anymore to attack on the king side. So too many pieces are trade in this position, or soon trade after the exchange of the rooks, and I think it's just about equal because white is also not able to win c6. So now let's have a look at an interesting game between Gelfand and Ivanchuk, two legends of our game at the top level since more than 30 years. And in this game, Ivanchuk with black showed a very nice way of playing this exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit. So here we reach the same position than in the previous game. So rook b1 again was not the most precise move for white, but at that time it was not so well known. And bishop f5, so black is able to trade his bad bishop. And here Gelfand comes up with an interesting idea, knight e5. So he wants to take back on d3 with the knight, what will allow him to play later knight c5 and apply a bit more pressure on the queen side before starting the minority attack with b5. So I think generally when you play for the minority attack, it's quite interesting to bring a knight to c5 first and then open the game on the queen side. So knight e5 makes a lot of sense. And Ivanchuk plays rook c8. So he's not forced to take on d3, he prefers to improve his pieces. And it's clear that the rook on c8 is indirectly facing the queen on c2. So it makes it difficult for white to push b5. So bishop takes g7, forces bishop takes d3. And now rook b3. So how to improve this position with black? In fact, Ivanchuk will do the same than Anatoly Weiser in the previous game. Bishop d6 with ID bishop b8, queen d6, and queen h2 checkmate if white is not careful. So here the position is already equal, and I think this bishop on d6 is quite good. After knight c5, black will simply play rook e7, and b7 is safe, and then we could continue with bishop b8, queen d6. The best move is probably to play queen b2 to get rid of the pressure on the c file. But after bishop b8, queen d6, now we have this typical reaction with cb5 and a5, threatening to play b6, and that's why white should play himself b6 to isolate the pawn on a5. And now we can attack on the queen side, on the king side with h5, h4. So for example, queen d7 threatening queen h3, and then knight g4, so forcing king g2. then a4, bishop d6, all gaining some time, chasing the white pieces, and rook c4. So here we see a situation where black has a total control of the game. The a pawn is quite strong, the c file is under control. The next moves are rook e c8, queen c6, and I think white cannot fight back on the c file. And if knight d5, tactically queen c6 is winning because of the pin. So we probably didn't play the best moves for white, but we see here exactly how black wants to play. And in the game, Gelfand made an interesting mistake. He pushed b5 a bit too fast. So now again, the same problematic, how to take on b5, a, b or cb. And Ivanchuk played cb5. The reason is on the c file he has the upper hand because queen c2 is weak. ab5 would be a mistake. So ab5 followed by c5 like always. But in this position, white has no problems. So the queen on e5 makes sure that d5 is strong enough. But the problem is black has no bad pieces in this position. White has also good pieces. So it means the position is balanced. And b5 is always a good compensation for the weakness on d5. So it means if white is going to win b5, he has probably to weaken b5. And when he takes d5, we can also take b5. So this position is completely equalizing. But Ivanchuk found cb5 much better. And now f5. So the point is that normally white would like to play b6 in this position. But here it's impossible because if b6, black plays knight e4 and attacks on the c file. So for example, queen b2, take, and queen b6. So that's why it was important to play instead of b6, queen b2. But this move comes a bit too late. And now black can play b6, and this position is typically an advantage for black. The next move is rook c4, controlling a4 and preparing queen c7, rook c8, and at some point again a4, a3. So this position is much better for black. White just played queen b2 and will probably continue the minority attack with b4, b5 on the next move. How should black prepare for this? So here a very interesting idea is bishop b8 followed by queen d6, and queen h2 checkmate is of course a threat. And when white defends himself, he is forced to weaken his position, and because of that, black takes the initiative. So cb5, a5. So white has to play b6 to isolate the pawn on f5. h5 with the idea h4, so white plays himself h4. Queen d7 with the idea queen h3, knight g4, so white has to play king g2. And now a4. So black plays on both wings and takes the initiative. And here, because knight d5 is not working after queen c6, winning some material, black has a strong advantage. White has played b4, b5 too early. How can black take advantage of this mistake? So here, always the same situation where we have to decide between ab5 and cb5. Here, AB5 is not the solution. Even if the position is not bad, it's not enough to have an advantage, because even if we have good pieces here, we are not able to apply extra pressure. So Ivanchuk in this position found CB5, much more logical, because here we see that the rook on C8 is targeting the queen on C2, and now F5. After queen B2, simply B6, and B6 and A5 are working together, and the next moves for black are probably rook C4, queen C7, rook C8, A4, A3, so black is able to develop some initiative on the queen side, and white has nothing to do. Gelfand could have played the strategically correct B6. How can you refute this move tactically? So here, after B6, the problem is the queen on C2 is in front of the rook on C8, and black can play knight E4, and trade on C3, and then win the pawn on B6. So black should win that quite easily.